Please don't let them tear down Greyhaven today. The request came from an 11-year-old girl sitting alone outside Richard Vale's office. She wore a woman's interview coat, its cuffs folded over her hands, and held a rusted lunchbox on her knees. "My mom's sick," she said. "So, I came instead." Her mother had been scheduled to interview for a cleaning job. Greyhaven was a condemned workers' residence scheduled for demolition that afternoon. The girl placed the lunchbox between them. Two initials had been carved into the lid, R.V.T.V. Richard had cut them there 20 years earlier while his younger brother Thomas complained that Richard kept stealing his sandwiches. 3 weeks later, Greyhaven's East Wing collapsed. Thomas was declared dead. Richard had placed that same lunchbox beside the temporary memorial before the ruins were sealed. "Who gave this to your mother?" he asked. "No one. She found it behind a wall that wasn't on the plans." The girl's name was Lena Ortiz. Her mother, Sophia, had worked overnight demolition cleanup. Hours after finding the box, she collapsed with severe breathing trouble. Then someone transferred her from a public hospital without telling Lena where she had been taken. Richard reached for his phone. Lena stopped him. "My mom said not to call anyone from your company." "Why?" "She said the last person who found that room was turned into a dead man." Before Richard could ask what she meant, his uncle Charles entered with the demolition papers ready for signature. Charles saw the lunchbox. He did not look surprised. He looked at the clock. "Richard," he said calmly, "the charges are already set." Something vibrated beneath the lunchbox's metal lining. Richard opened a hidden compartment and found an old Greyhaven emergency pager, its battery recently replaced, its cracked screen blinking with a live signal. One message appeared. "Wing C still copied." Richard did not sign the demolition order. He placed the pen beside the folder and looked at Charles. "Stop the charges." Charles remained standing, one hand on the back of a chair. At 68, he still carried the calm authority that had made bankers trust him during the Greyhaven crisis, and employees call him the man who saved Vale Industries. He had also raised Richard after the deaths of Richard's parents, teaching him that panic destroyed companies faster than bad news. "The site has been cleared," Charles said. "The explosives team has municipal approval." "Then call them." Richard turned to Lena. "Come inside." The girl followed him into the office, holding the lunchbox tightly against her coat. Charles entered before Richard could close the door. "This concerns the company," Charles said. "It concerns my brother. Thomas has been gone for 20 years. The pager's message had vanished, leaving a weak green pulse on the cracked screen. Wing C had never appeared on the public plans. Greyhaven's residential blocks had been labeled by direction and floor, not by letter. If Wing C existed, it belonged to an older internal layout. Richard called the demolition supervisor. No answer. Charles glanced toward the lunchbox. A child arrives with a stolen artifact and a theatrical warning hours before a valuable property transfer. "You know what this looks like." Lena's shoulders tightened. "She didn't ask for money," Richard said. "Not yet." Lena opened the folder beneath her coat. Inside were Sophia Ortiz's resume, 2 work references, and a hospital transfer sheet. The interview badge had been issued at 8. Lena had apparently spent nearly 2 hours moving between reception desks before anyone allowed her upstairs. "My mother said rich people always ask what poor people want before they ask what happened," she said. "She wanted a job. That was before she found the room." Sophia had been admitted at 2:14 that morning with acute respiratory distress. At 6:40, she had been transferred to St. Orson Residential Care. The name stirred a distant memory. "Why send a respiratory patient to long-term care?" Richard asked. Charles answered first. "St. Orson has a private recovery wing. The Vale Family Continuity Trust supports it. Our trust moved her? A contractor may have arranged emergency care." Richard called St. Orson. Admissions confirmed Sophia was registered, but refused to connect him without authorization. When he asked who had approved the transfer, the woman repeated a privacy statement and ended the call. Lena watched him lower the phone. "They told me she wasn't there." That difference mattered. Richard asked her about the room. Sophia had found it behind a recently added wall in Greyhaven's East Service corridor. A demolition crew opened a gap to inspect pipes, revealing a metal cabinet, a cot frame, and numbers painted beneath whitewash. A supervisor ordered everyone out before Sophia could photograph the interior. She returned after midnight and found the lunchbox inside the cabinet. "Did she take anything else?" Richard asked. Lena shook her head, then stopped. My mom doesn't steal. That wasn't my question. She looked at Charles before reaching into her sleeve. She removed a small section of an old site map, sealed in clear tape. 3 colored threads had been pushed through it, red at the east corridor, blue beside an unlabeled stairwell, and yellow near a room numbered 29. My mother hides colors in things when she thinks someone will search her bag, Lena said. Red means danger, blue means another way in, yellow means a person. Charles sighed. This is why security should handle the matter. The map bore an engineering revision stamp dated 2 days before the collapse. Richard remembered Thomas leaning across a drafting table, tapping the eastern edge of a plan. Thomas had been 29, impatient and certain that numbers mattered more than deadlines. You can't monitor a wall after it falls. Richard had dismissed the warning and left to meet investors. He requested Greyhaven's archived structural files. ACCESS. Denied. He tried the executive override. Records restricted by legal hold. Who placed the hold? Charles paused before answering. Our legal department protects sensitive records automatically. Richard photographed the map, pager, and lunchbox. He sent the images to an independent forensic specialist outside the company network. He did not include Thomas's name or explain what he hoped the objects would prove. Charles stepped closer. You are allowing grief to make decisions for you. No, grief made my decisions 20 years ago. Richard's phone rang. The demolition supervisor's name appeared. Wind and machinery filled the line. Mr. Vale, we received the stop order, but there's a problem. What problem? The east charges have been disconnected. Richard looked at Lena's red thread. Then no one touches that building. That's not what I mean, the supervisor said. Someone disconnected them from inside. The convoy reached Greyhaven 12 minutes after the demolition crew cut power to the detonators. Richard sat in the rear vehicle with Lena beside him, and Charles across from them. Lena kept the lunchbox on her lap, one hand over the hidden compartment. Greyhaven stood at the edge of the river district, 7 stories of stained concrete and boarded windows. The east wing leaned toward an abandoned rail yard. Orange demolition netting snapped in the wind. The site supervisor, Martin Keller, met them behind the security fence. We cleared every floor twice, he said. No workers remained inside. Then who disconnected the charges? Richard asked. Keller looked toward Charles before answering. We don't know. Lena noticed the glance. She had been watching adults all morning, as if every pause were a door. Municipal inspectors had sealed the east entrance. Richard expected his title to open it. Instead, a fire official blocked him. The structure is unstable, no civilians. I own the building. That does not make the floor stronger. Richard asked what would be required. A structural engineer approved a limited ground floor inspection if Richard entered with a rescue officer and signed a waiver. Lena was not permitted inside. I found the map, she said. You're also 11. My mother went in there alone. And that is why you're staying out. Her face hardened. You said we would work together. I said we would tell each other the truth. This building can kill you. She handed him the map. Blue thread is another way in. Don't follow the new arrows. Mom said they point away from the old stairs. Richard entered with the engineer and rescue officer. Charles remained outside with Lena after Richard ordered security to leave the lunchbox with her. Inside, Greyhaven smelled of wet plaster, rust, and old dust. Fresh survey marks covered the walls. The demolition team had painted safe paths in green, but Sophia's blue thread led toward a narrow passage hidden behind insulation panels. The old stairwell was still there. It had been covered, not removed. At the bottom, the rescue officer found the severed firing cable. Someone had removed the coupling by hand and placed the cap beside it. Recently? Richard asked. The engineer touched the clean metal, within hours. A smear of black grease crossed the wall. Beneath it, 3 marks had been scratched into the concrete. Long, short, long. Thomas used to tap that pattern against pipes when they were children. It meant wait. Richard did not tell the others. The passage ended at a wall newer than everything around it. Sophia's red thread pierced the map at that location. Near the floor, someone had cleared dust from a narrow vent. Richard aimed his flashlight through it. A cot frame stood on the other side, beside a metal cabinet and numbered hooks. 27, 28, 29. The room was empty. Can we open it? Richard asked. Not without shoring the ceiling, the engineer said. A scrape sounded beyond the wall, followed by 2 knocks. The rescue officer called out. No answer came. They searched the adjacent passage and found a maintenance door opening onto the rail yard. Its chain had been cut from the inside. When Richard returned, Lena was arguing with Charles. "You knew there was another stair," she said. Charles remained composed. "I knew old buildings have old plans. You looked at the blue thread before Mr. Vale explained it." Charles turned to Richard. "This is becoming irresponsible." "Someone was inside," Richard said. "They left through the rail yard." Lena's anger became fear. "My mom said the room had been waiting for someone. What does that mean?" "She wouldn't tell me." Charles checked his watch. "The site can be secured while professionals investigate. The board is already asking why you suspended a sale over a child's map." Richard looked back at Greyhaven. Thomas had been 29 when the East Wing collapsed. Coincidence had begun to feel like a word people used when they wanted an inquiry to stop. Richard ordered Keller to preserve the site and surrender all access logs to an outside firm. Keller said the logs belonged to the demolition contractor. "Then request them." Their attorney already placed them under review. The obstruction was immediate and legal. Before they left, Richard's phone displayed 3 board alerts. The sale committee demanded a written explanation within an hour. Legal instructed him not to contact Sophia without counsel. A third notice suspended his access to archived Greyhaven records until the hold was reviewed. Lena read his expression. "Can they stop you from finding my mom? They can slow me down." "That means yes." Richard did not correct her. Power looked different when every door required someone else's permission. Richard took Lena to Sophia's apartment. It sat above a laundromat 3 miles away. The rooms were clean but nearly bare. An inhaler rested beside unpaid utility notices. Replacement respirator filters had been sealed in bags and dated in Sophia's handwriting. The newest filter was gray-green instead of white. Lena opened a cabinet filled with labeled envelopes. "My mother keeps everything because people say poor workers remember wrong." One envelope contained copies of Sophia's complaints about dust exposure. Each had been returned with a different explanation. Insufficient sample, subcontractor jurisdiction, no confirmed hazard. Another held photographs of supply labels from Greyhaven. Several crates marked as harmless insulation carried a second code beneath the sticker. Richard photographed the codes. "Did your mother know what was in them?" She said she didn't know enough to accuse anyone. That answer impressed him more than certainty would have. Richard examined the lunchbox again. Its lining had been stitched with thick brown thread. One section used 3 short stitches, followed by a gap. Thomas had marked measurements that way on field sketches. Richard removed the loose panel. Shallow cuts underneath formed 4 pairs of numbers. Lena brought the old map. The first pair matched the east corridor. The second pointed to the concealed stair. The third ended at room 29. The fourth did not belong to Greyhaven. Richard entered the coordinates into his phone. They led to a warehouse owned by a laundry supplier serving St. Orson residential care. The lunchbox was no longer only a relic. Someone familiar with Thomas's field marks had turned it into a route. Lena watched him absorb that fact. "Are you going to pay my mother's hospital bill now? If it keeps her safe." That isn't what she wanted. What did she want? For someone to believe her before she almost died. Richard looked at the returned complaints. His company logo appeared at the top of every response, even when a contractor had signed the bottom. "I can't promise your mother will be safe," he said. "I can promise I won't hand this back to the people who ignored her." Lena studied him. "Those are different promises." "Yes." She nodded once. A phone alarm sounded from Sophia's bedroom. Lena ran to a tablet charging beside the bed. A scheduled message opened automatically. Sophia's face appeared, pale and breathless. "If Lena is watching this, I missed the time I promised to call." Lena gripped the bed frame. Sophia held up the lunchbox. "Do not believe anyone who says I found it by accident. Someone put it back inside Greyhaven after the demolition survey began." She lowered her voice. "I saw him do it." The recording shook as footsteps sounded outside her room. Before the screen went dark, Sophia added one final sentence. The man in the east corridor had Richard Vale's face. Richard watched the final frame until the screen dimmed. Lena stood beside the tablet, both hands wrapped around the bed frame. She did not ask whether Sophia might have been confused. Richard was grateful for that. He had already heard enough adults use uncertainty as permission to stop looking. "Did your mother ever meet Thomas?" he asked. "No." "Did she know what he looked like?" She saw pictures at Greyhaven. The company put his face on the memorial boards. That left several possibilities, none of them clean. Sophia could have seen a stranger who resembled Richard. Someone could have dressed to create that impression. Or the man could have been Thomas, older by 20 years, and still close enough in feature to be mistaken for his brother. Richard sent the recording to the independent forensic specialist, then asked Lena whether Sophia kept backup copies elsewhere. She said one copy is a mistake. Lena opened the lining of her mother's work bag. A strip of red thread had been stitched beneath the zipper. Inside the seam, Richard found a memory card wrapped in wax paper. The card held photographs from 3 different nights at Greyhaven. Sophia had documented the altered wall before the demolition team opened it. She had photographed the serial numbers on the insulation crates. She had also captured the maintenance board showing that the East Corridor's motion sensors had registered activity on nights when the property was officially empty. A final folder contained short videos of Sophia walking through her own apartment and explaining where she had placed evidence. "She made these for you?" Richard asked. For whoever believed me after she couldn't talk. The distinction settled heavily between them. Sophia's first action had been to copy the records. Her second had been to mark physical routes with colored thread. Her third had been to create timed messages and hide duplicate evidence where a routine search would not find it. She had not stumbled into the truth and waited to be rescued. She had built a path for someone else to continue. Richard called the outside security firm he had hired that morning. He instructed them to preserve Greyhaven's surveillance servers before the demolition contractor could replace or wipe them. The answer came 30 minutes later. The servers had already been collected by corporate legal. Charles arrived at the apartment before noon. He did not bring security. He brought a doctor from St. Orson and a lawyer carrying a thin settlement folder. The hospital transferred Sophia because her oxygen levels made independent living unsafe, the doctor said. She became agitated when staff questioned her about the items she removed from the site. "Where is her signed consent?" Richard asked. The lawyer placed a form on the table. The signature looked like Sophia's name, but the final letter ended in a smooth loop. Every label and complaint in the apartment showed Sophia finishing her name with a hard downward stroke. Lena noticed it too. "My mother doesn't write like that." The lawyer turned the paper toward her. People sign differently under medical distress. Richard photographed the document. Charles remained near the door, looking more tired than defensive. "You are letting a frightened child interpret evidence she cannot understand," he said. "She understood the signature before your lawyer did." Charles lowered his voice. "Richard, the board is considering an emergency vote. Pause this for 24 hours. Let St. Orson stabilize Sophia. We can cover every medical expense and guarantee Lena's housing." Lena's expression closed immediately. Richard had seen that look when he offered to pay the bill. "What do you want in return?" he asked. "Nothing improper. A temporary confidentiality agreement until the facts are reviewed. The site is scheduled to be destroyed. The demolition can be delayed without turning speculation into a public accusation." Richard looked at the settlement folder. It offered Sophia medical coverage, 6 months of wages, and a relocation payment. In return, she would surrender materials removed from Greyhaven and refrain from discussing workplace conditions. The agreement had been drafted before Lena arrived at Vale Industries. Richard slid it back. "You prepared this before you knew what she found." Charles's face did not change. "Legal prepares for risk." Legal knew there was a risk. The doctor's gaze shifted toward the lawyer. Charles left without threatening him. That restraint made the offer more dangerous, not less. By early afternoon, the first story appeared online. Demolition worker accused of using child in Vale family extortion attempt. The article cited unnamed company sources. It described Sophia as unstable, claimed Lena had trespassed into restricted areas, and suggested the lunchbox had been copied from memorial photographs. It did not mention the missing hospital consent form. Lena read only the headline before Richard took the phone from her. "My mother said this would happen." What exactly did she say? That poor people become dishonest as soon as rich people need them to be. Richard wanted to tell her the article would not matter. It already did. The demolition supervisor stopped returning calls. The city's safety office postponed its inspection, pending ownership clarification. M.A. Orson's lawyer warned that further contact with Sophia could be treated as interference with care. Richard's authority had not disappeared. It had been divided into pieces held by people who could delay him while claiming to follow procedure. The structural engineer called at 3:10. Temporary supports had been installed around the concealed room. Richard could enter, but only with a municipal inspector and no more than one additional civilian. Lena insisted on going. "No," Richard said. "The room was marked for a person. My mother made the map. And the ceiling is still unstable. She trusted me with the colors." Richard almost refused again. Then he understood that keeping Lena outside every meaningful decision would repeat the same pattern Sophia had anticipated. Adults using protection to take control of the truth. He negotiated with the inspector. Lena was allowed to stand at the reinforced threshold wearing a respirator and hard hat. She could not cross the marked line. Inside room 29, the cot frame had been bolted to the floor. A small sink had no connection to the building's original plumbing. The metal cabinet stood open and mostly empty. The room did not look untouched for 20 years. Dust covered the corners, but a clean rectangle marked where a portable battery had recently rested. A paper cup in the sink was still damp beneath its rim. Lena pointed to a strip of blue fabric caught under the cot. It carried a faded laundry code, beginning with the letters S.O. The inspector bagged it without guessing what it meant. On the wall, someone had drawn short vertical marks in groups of 7. The newest line cut through fresh paint. Sophia's photographs showed 3 folders inside the cabinet 2 nights earlier. Only one remained. Its label read, Continuity Patient T29. The pages identified the patient as Thomas Archer, male, 29 at admission, transferred after an industrial accident. The surname had been typed over correction tape. No next of kin appeared. Monthly payments came from the Vale Family Continuity Trust. Richard turned to the final page. An authorization permitted indefinite private placement, restricted visitors, and identity protection due to cognitive instability and litigation exposure. His own signature appeared beneath it. Lena leaned toward the threshold. "Did you sign that?" "I don't remember it." The inspector asked whether the signature could have been copied. Richard studied the authorization code. It was not only a handwritten mark. The document listed a digital certificate tied to the secure executive device he had used 19 years earlier. The same year, he spent 11 days unconscious after his car left an icy road. Charles had kept that device in the hospital safe. A noise came from the corridor. One of the outside investigators hurried in with a recovered section of surveillance footage. The video showed Sophia entering the East Passage at 12:41 a.m. She carried no lunchbox. At 12:58, she emerged holding it. The 17 minutes between those images were missing, not corrupted, removed. The deletion request had been issued through a Vale executive credential 2 hours after Sophia collapsed. Richard asked whose credential. The investigator hesitated. "Yours." The investigator traced the blue fabric to a laundry supplier called Northline Textile Services. Northline handled linens for 6 private clinics, 3 assisted living facilities, and St. Orson Residential Care. Its warehouse stood beside the old freight tracks, less than 2 miles from Greyhaven. Richard expected the company to provide delivery logs. Instead, its attorney replied within 20 minutes. All records related to St. Orson had been placed under a preservation hold. The phrase sounded cooperative. In practice, it meant nothing would be released without a subpoena. Lena sat at Sophia's kitchen table while Richard read the response. "They keep saying they're protecting things," she said. "But nobody lets us see what they protected." Richard looked at the laundry code in the photograph. S.O.C.29. The middle letter could indicate a wing. The number could be a room, a cart, or a patient route. He called the Independenter investigator, Mara Keene, and asked her to check Northline's public delivery permits rather than its private records. Municipal route filings showed a truck leaving St. Orson every Thursday at 4:30 p.m. The same truck stopped at an off-site document warehouse owned by Northline's parent company. It was Thursday. Richard told Lena she would remain with a licensed child advocate while he followed the truck. "No, that was not a question. My mother marked the laundry code. You didn't know what the colors meant until I told you. And you should not have to solve this. Neither should she." Richard heard the difference. Lena was not asking to be included for adventure. She was refusing to be placed outside the truth, while adults decided what happened to her mother. He compromised. Lena would travel with Mara, stay in the vehicle, and leave immediately if anything changed. A social worker from the outside firm would remain with her. Northline's truck reached the document warehouse at 5:12. Workers unloaded sealed rolling bins marked for destruction. Each bin carried a certificate number and a scheduled shredding date. Mara checked the numbers against public procurement filings. One bin had been entered into the system that morning under an emergency medical retention exception. St. Orson Wing, see Archive. Richard called the State Health Records Office. The official on duty confirmed that medical records could not be destroyed while subject to an active inquiry. Richard forwarded the T-29 authorization and Sophia's disputed transfer form. The official issued a temporary preservation notice. That afternoon, procedure finally worked in Richard's favor. Warehouse management allowed inspectors inside but refused Richard access to patient files. He could observe the inventory process from a marked area while the state official cataloged the bins. Lena remained outside with Mara. Through the warehouse glass, Richard saw Charles arrive with the same lawyer who had brought Sophia's settlement agreement. Charles did not appear surprised to find him there. "You are turning a family tragedy into a regulatory spectacle," he said. "You transferred a sick worker into a facility you control. The trust supports the facility. It does not control clinical decisions." "And Thomas Archer?" The lawyer stepped between them. "You are referring to protected medical information." Richard watched Charles rather than the lawyer. "Is he my brother?" Charles's expression held. "You have a photograph, a damaged file, and a child's interpretation of a stitched map. Grief is not identification." It was not an answer. The state inspector ordered everyone away from the archive room while she opened the bins. Richard moved to the corridor near the loading bay. A metal door had not closed completely. Charles and the lawyer entered the adjoining office, their voices low but audible through the gap. "The transfer should have happened before demolition day," the lawyer said. "It could not happen without attracting review," Charles replied. "And now Richard has the authorization. He has a copy. Copies create questions. They do not create standing. What about the resident?" A pause followed. "Do not move anyone from Wing C until the land sale is completed." "And Sophia Ortiz?" "She is receiving care. She can identify him," Charles answered more quietly. "Only if people decide her memory is more reliable than her condition." The lawyer asked, "What will you tell Richard if he reaches the patient?" Charles looked toward the warehouse floor. "That he arrived too late once before. He will believe it before he believes anything else." Their footsteps shifted. Richard moved away before the door opened. He had heard enough to confirm obstruction, but not enough to prove why Charles wanted the Wing C resident hidden. Charles had not named Thomas. He had not admitted falsifying a record or ordering Sophia's transfer. Every sentence could be reframed as concern for a vulnerable patient. Mara called from outside. Lena saw something. Richard returned to the vehicle. Lena pointed toward a laundry cart waiting beside the loading dock. The carts were separated by destination. One bore the same code as the fabric from room 29. S.O.C. 29. A clear pouch on its side contained a route sheet. No patient name appeared, only supply quantities and initials, T.A. The sheet listed weekly deliveries for 12 years. Men's medium clothing, unscented soap, graph paper, 2 mechanical pencils. No mirrors. "Why graph paper?" Lena asked. Richard remembered Thomas filling margins with load calculations, stair angles, and little bridges that could never stand. The memory was not evidence. The state inspector eventually released an inventory list rather than the files themselves. One box contained intake photographs for patients admitted under continuity protection. Another held Guardian correspondence. A third contained incident reports from Wing C. Richard petitioned for emergency review based on possible identity fraud and unlawful restriction. The judge on call refused immediate access without proof that Thomas Archer lacked capacity or had been held against his will. Legal protection had become a sealed room around the truth. The inspector did allow Richard's forensic specialist to examine non-medical metadata. The T-29 folder had been reprinted 3 times. The oldest surviving version identified the patient as Thomas Archer, but the name field showed evidence of correction fluid beneath the ink. The original paper record had been removed. A contact sheet from the intake box could be viewed only after the inspector covered unrelated patients. The final photograph showed a man seated in profile. His hair had been burned away on one side. Bandages covered his jaw and neck. The image was blurred, but the line of his nose and the uneven height of his shoulders matched Thomas. Richard felt certainty rise, then forced it back down. The admission form listed blood type AB positive. Thomas had been O negative. Mara read the discrepancy twice. If the blood type is accurate, this isn't him. Lena looked from the form to the photograph. Can records be wrong? Yes, Richard said. But wanting them to be wrong doesn't make them wrong. The specialist found no indication that the blood type entry had been altered. The image date matched the week after the collapse. Dental notes described 2 missing molars. Thomas had never lost. The evidence had moved away from the answer Richard wanted. Charles returned to the loading area after speaking with the inspector. You see the danger now, he said. A wounded worker resembled Thomas. I paid for his care because the company owed him that much. There was no conspiracy in keeping an unstable man away from reporters and lawyers. Why hide him under a false identity? Because Greyhaven survivors were being hunted for statements by people who wanted settlements. Why did he have my authorization? You signed many emergency documents after the collapse. Richard did not mention the hospital records showing he had been unconscious when the certificate was issued. Charles continued. Come back to the board. Let Sophia recover. Let Lena go home. You can still stop this from becoming cruelty disguised as investigation. The explanation fit enough facts to be dangerous. A survivor, mistaken for Thomas. A private payment born from guilt. A protected identity. A grieving brother seeing what he needed to see. Lena remained near the vehicle as Charles walked away. She was studying the contact photograph Richard had been permitted to copy. What? He asked. She pointed to the man's hand. The image was blurred, and 2 fingers disappeared beneath a blanket. Between them rested a small piece of metal cut into a jagged edge. Richard enlarged the photograph. The object was half of a silver coin. Its broken side formed the same lightning-shaped line as the half Richard had carried in his wallet for 20 years. The court rejected Richard's first request for a DNA test. Thomas Archer was an adult patient under legal guardianship. Resemblance, possession of a family object, and an unresolved identity question were not enough to override medical privacy. Charles remained the registered guardian. Richard read the order in Sophia's apartment while Lena sorted her mother's photographs by date. So he can keep saying no? She asked. For now, even if the man is your brother? The court says we have not proved that yet. Lena placed the intake photograph beside Richard's half of the coin, then proved something else first. Richard shifted the investigation away from identity and back to Greyhaven. If Thomas had survived, the collapse had created the opportunity to erase him. But the older question came first. Why had the East Wing fallen? Mara obtained the structural report filed after the disaster. It blamed hidden corrosion, unauthorized tenant alterations, and delayed evacuation caused by confusion among residents. The language felt familiar because Richard had repeated it for years. The memory card from Sophia's work bag contained a photograph of a different report cover. Its revision number ended in 4A. The public report ended in 4C. 2 versions were missing. Richard contacted Evelyn Shaw, the engineer whose name appeared on both documents. She was 74 and agreed to speak by video, but refused to be recorded. I signed the inspection, she said. I did not write the conclusion they filed. Who changed it? I never saw the final chain. Did Thomas? Her eyes moved away from the screen. Thomas found movement in the east supports. He wanted the residence emptied. Richard remembered the argument, but not the words he wanted to remember. He told me the monitoring equipment was unreliable. He told everyone. You were the one person he thought could stop the work. The statement restored the choice Richard had spent 20 years reducing to confusion. Do you have your original notes? I kept copies until someone from Vale Legal visited after the settlement. Who? I signed an agreement. Richard offered independent counsel. Evelyn ended the call. By evening, an anonymous envelope arrived at Mara's office. Inside was a photocopy of one handwritten page. East Wing immediate evacuation recommended. Below it, Thomas had drawn a box around a pressure reading and written, if they delay again, open corridor C. It is the only route not controlled by site security. The notation linked Thomas's warning to the hidden corridor. It also raised another question. Why would an emergency route be kept off the plans used by residents? Mara traced the original building permits. Corridor C had been reclassified as a private utility passage 2 months before the collapse. Public access doors were fitted with electronic locks. The authorization came from Vale Site Operations. Charles had supervised that division, Richard called him. Why was Corridor C locked? Because tenants were entering an active construction area. It was also the safest exit from the East Wing. That became clear after the collapse. Thomas knew before. Thomas believed many things urgently. Charles's voice stayed level. You are taking technical fragments and arranging them around your guilt. That does not make a case. No. It makes a timeline. Charles ended the call. The next witness was Samuel Pierce, a former city rescue captain. His name appeared on an ambulance dispatch sheet Sophia had photographed inside room 29. Samuel remembered the night clearly. Rescue teams found a living man beneath the East Service stairs nearly 4 hours after the official search moved to the riverside. The man had burns, a head injury, and no identification. Was he taken to St. Orson? Richard asked. Not by us. A Black Veil medical van arrived with documents claiming the survivor had been exposed to hazardous material and required private isolation. The field commander objected, but a city administrator approved the transfer. Could the man have been Thomas Vale? I saw him for maybe 30 seconds. He looked like your family. Will you give a statement? I will tell the truth. Mara arranged a sworn interview for the following morning. It never happened. Before sunrise, an article described Samuel as a disgraced former officer with a history of alcohol treatment and disciplinary complaints. It included material from a confidential personnel file. Reporters surrounded his home. Samuel canceled. Richard found him closing his curtains while television vans crowded the street. I'm not asking you to face them, Richard said. You already did. I did not release those records. You opened a fight with people who know where every weak part of a man is stored. Richard offered legal support and relocation. Samuel refused. If I take your money now, no one will believe me later. The answer echoed Lena's refusal of the hospital payment. At St. Orson, Sophia's oxygen level was stable, but the facility's physician had diagnosed acute confusion and recommended sedation because she had tried to leave. Mara challenged the treatment through a patient advocate. St. Orson responded with a note claiming Sophia had repeatedly spoken about a dead man living in a wall. The truth had been translated into a symptom. Lena was allowed a supervised video call. Sophia appeared drowsy. Mom, do you know where you are? Sophia looked past the camera. Don't use names. Whose names? The list. A nurse moved closer. Sophia touched 3 fingers to her collar, then 2 to the bedrail. After the call, Lena took out the map. 3 red stitches, 2 blue. They found an old Greyhaven memorial photograph marked the same way. On its back, Sophia had written, R312. The number matched a records locker leased by the demolition contractor. The company refused access. A state workplace safety inquiry obtained a warrant. Inside R312 were respirator filters, damaged phones, boots, and sealed boxes collected after the collapse. One box carried Thomas's employee number. It contained a recorder with a cracked casing. The audio was weak, but recoverable. Thomas's voice described East Support movement, a locked emergency route, and pressure from management to delay evacuation until investors completed a site visit. Another voice interrupted him. Richard recognized his own. The recording came from the morning before the collapse. We cannot empty the residence based on one reading, Richard said. You know it isn't one reading, Thomas answered. I have the financing meeting in an hour, and I have family sleeping over a wall that is moving. The recording ended with Richard saying he would review the report after the meeting. He never returned in time. Lena listened without accusation. Richard had spent years believing Charles had hidden the entire truth. The recording proved that before anyone forged a document, Richard had chosen delay. He asked Mara to add the audio to the official evidence file under his own name. The board called an emergency session. Richard disclosed the recording before Charles could frame it. I ignored a warning, he said. That decision must be investigated with everything else. Directors demanded that he step aside. The insurer warned that his statement could reopen settled claims. Legal advised him to withdraw it as grief rather than fact. Richard refused. He requested a full external audit and offered to surrender executive control until it was complete. The vote passed. His access to company systems ended at 4:06 p.m. At 4:11, Mara received the metadata report from the deleted surveillance footage. The removal had been authorized with Richard's credential, but not from his office, phone, or home network. It came from a terminal inside the Vale Family Continuity Trust. The same terminal had approved Sophia's transfer. It had also accessed the restricted T29 file 6 times during the week before demolition, always after midnight and always under Richard's executive certificate. Then Lena's tablet sounded. A second scheduled message from Sophia had been released. The screen showed a photograph taken 3 weeks earlier at Greyhaven. Sophia stood near the concealed east entrance. Beside her was an older man, with burn scars along his jaw and Richard's eyes. In one hand, he held the rusted lunchbox. In the other, half of a silver coin. On the back, Sophia had written. He said his name was Thomas. Richard did not go to St. Orson as CEO. He arrived as the legal relative of a man who might be his brother, accompanied by Mara, an independent physician, and a court-appointed patient advocate. His withdrawal from Vale Industries had removed the assumption that he could command doors open. It also removed the excuse that every question was a corporate maneuver. The judge had not approved DNA testing. She had approved one supervised meeting because the continuity records contained conflicting identities, a disputed authorization, and evidence that Sophia's transfer had been arranged through the same trust. Charles attended as Thomas Archer's guardian. Wing C occupied the oldest part of St. Orson. Its hallway was narrow, with reinforced windows and doors controlled from a central desk. Room 29 held graph paper sketches of bridges, stairwells, and load-bearing frames. The man seated near the window looked older than Richard had imagined. Burn scars tightened the left side of his jaw. His right hand trembled against the armrest. He watched the visitors as though deciding which version of them had entered. Richard had rehearsed Thomas's name during the drive. He could not say it. The patient advocate introduced everyone. "This is Richard Vale," she said. "He believes you may have known his family." The man studied Richard. "You got old." Richard kept his voice level. "So did you." Charles moved closer. "Thomas Archer has periods of recognition that are not reliable." The man looked at him. "You still answer before people ask you." The physician noted the exchange without interpreting it. Richard placed his half of the coin on the table. The man did not reach for it. "You carried that in your left pocket," he said. "Because you lost everything in the right one." When they were teenagers, Richard had torn a hole in his right jacket pocket and lost a week's wages. Thomas had mocked him for months. The story had never appeared in family records. Mara asked whether he remembered the other half. The man turned toward the window. "Objects remember better than people." Richard showed him the photograph Sophia had taken at Greyhaven. "Did you meet this woman?" She listened. "What did you tell her?" "That the wall was going to disappear." "Why return the lunchbox?" The man's fingers pressed into the chair arm. "It had already done what Charles wanted. It proved I was dead." Charles addressed the advocate. "This is precisely the associative confusion described in his evaluations." Richard ignored him. "Did Charles keep you here?" "No." The answer landed harder than an accusation. "I signed papers," the man continued. "I asked not to see you." "Why?" "Because you chose the company." He pointed toward Mara's recorder. "You said families could wait until after your meeting. Then the building fell. Charles showed me your signature. He said you approved the new name because Vale could not survive another claimant." Richard heard the old recording in his own voice. He had delayed the evacuation. That part was true. "I did not approve your disappearance. You approve things and forget." The sentence carried no anger. The advocate stopped Richard from moving closer. The physician asked the man whether he knew his legal name. "Thomas Archer." "Have you ever used another name?" A long pause. "Names are doors. Some are locked from the outside." The physician asked whether he wanted Richard to return. The man looked at the coin and then at Charles. "Not until he remembers what he signed." The meeting ended without permission for DNA testing. Outside Wing C, Charles handed Richard an agreement dated 6 days after the collapse. It authorized protective placement for an unidentified survivor and gave the Vale Family Continuity Trust control over medical access until the patient regained capacity. Richard's signature appeared at the bottom. A note stated that Richard had reviewed it in the presence of 2 attorneys. One was dead, the other had retired overseas. "You were not unconscious every hour after Greyhaven," Charles said. "You signed documents, you asked for sedatives, then you forgot." Why was his name changed? He had no confirmed identity when he arrived. You knew who he was. I suspected. He denied it. His blood type did not match Thomas's file, and his dental record belonged to another worker. Records your trust controlled. Records created by a hospital before the trust existed. Charles continued. Thomas believed you abandoned him. You believed he was dead. I kept a damaged man away from a brother who could barely stand. You may hate the decision. That does not make it kidnapping. Richard wanted a clean lie he could destroy. Instead, Charles gave him a version built around facts Richard had helped create. Mara sent the agreement to an outside document examiner. The ink, paper, and typeface appeared consistent with records from the period. The executive certificate matched Richard's old device. For several hours, the case shifted. Thomas might have survived. Charles might have concealed him at first, then maintained a placement Thomas later accepted. Richard might have signed during a period he no longer remembered. The conspiracy narrowed into a family decision made under catastrophe, cruel but possibly legal. Richard told Mara to suspend public accusations until they could verify the agreement. Lena heard him from Sophia's apartment. You're stopping? I'm checking whether I did what he says. My mother is still in that building. I know. Thomas is still in that building. He said he chose to stay away. He also said names can be locked from outside. Richard looked at the agreement. If I signed it, I cannot pretend I didn't because the truth hurts. Lena studied the first page. My mother says dates are where liars get tired. She carried the agreement to the kitchen window. The document listed the Vale Executive Office as 410 Harbor Center. Vale Industries had operated from Mason Street after Greyhaven. The company did not buy Harbor Center until 2 years later. Mara checked archived property filings. The address did not exist as a Vale office on the date printed at the top. The document had been created later and backdated. The examiner returned to the paper with a different question. Under magnification, the toner contained a polymer introduced several years after the collapse. Someone had used period stationery and an archived certificate to manufacture a plausible record after Richard's memory became unreliable. The false resolution broke apart. Charles had not preserved a decision. He had built proof of one. Richard had spent years treating missing memory as a private weakness. Charles had turned it into an instrument. Whenever a record appeared, Richard was expected to doubt himself before doubting the document. The response came before Richard could seek another court order. Vale Legal filed an emergency petition accusing Sophia of theft, unlawful entry, and attempted extortion. St. Orson requested authority to continue her sedation. Charles sought a restraining order, preventing Richard from contacting Thomas Archer pending psychiatric review. A child welfare investigator arrived at Sophia's apartment. An anonymous report alleged that Lena had been taken into an unstable demolition site, exposed to hazardous material, and used to pressure a wealthy family. Lena stood behind Richard as the investigator asked where she had slept. With my mother's neighbor. Do you feel safe there? I feel safer than when people move my mother and refuse to tell me. The investigator explained that temporary placement could be ordered if Sophia remained unavailable and no approved guardian was identified. At the same time, the city posted a notice at Greyhaven. Demolition would resume at noon the next day unless Richard produced evidence of an immediate public hazard. The board had approved the land sale without him, Charles called once. You wanted the system involved, he said. Now the system will decide what each of you is fit to control. Richard looked at the backdated agreement, the child welfare notice, and the demolition deadline. Charles was not attacking one piece of evidence. He was turning every institution around it into pressure. Then I'll give them something they cannot classify as grief. Richard opened Thomas's old lunchbox and began removing the stitched lining. Near the bottom seam, beneath a patch Lena had not noticed before, something thin crackled under the fabric. The hidden material was a strip of microfilm sealed inside waxed paper. Richard held it beneath the kitchen light, while Mara called a forensic lab that could develop old engineering film without damaging it. Lena stood beside him, watching the narrow strip as if it might speak before anyone touched it. The first images appeared 2 hours later. Thomas's original safety report. A handwritten list of families assigned to the East Wing, photographs of the locked corridor C doors, and a ledger page showing that emergency relief money had been transferred into the Vale Family Continuity Trust 3 days after the collapse. The report carried Thomas's full recommendation. Evacuate, East Wing immediately. Support failure is progressive. The public version had reduced that warning to continued monitoring. Mara compared the typing marks, staple holes, and revision stamps. The microfilm pages had been photographed before the filed version was altered. "This can stop the demolition," she said. "It can delay it," Richard answered. "Stopping it requires the family vote." Vale Industries had been built around one protective clause. In a declared threat to legacy property, the eldest direct heir could suspend a sale for 30 days. Richard had never used it. Charles had taught him that the clause existed only to protect the company from emotional decisions by future generations. Now, the company's future depended on whether Richard was willing to make one. The board assembled by video at 9:30 the next morning. Charles sat in the chairman's seat. Richard presented the report, the corridor photographs, and the relief fund transfer. He did not include speculation about Thomas's identity. He did not ask the directors to believe Lena, Sophia, or his memory. He asked them to preserve a potential crime scene. The finance committee warned that suspending the sale would trigger penalties, lender review, and layoffs across 3 construction divisions. One director said the company could lose more than $400 million. Charles waited until the figures had settled. Richard is asking thousands of employees to pay for a tragedy that occurred before many of them were born. Richard looked at the relief ledger. "That is the same argument we used when the families asked why their claims disappeared. We kept the company alive, with money meant for people who lost their homes." Charles leaned toward the camera. "You do not know what would have happened without that decision. I know what happened with it." The board voted 11-2 to proceed with demolition. Richard invoked the family clause. For several seconds, no one spoke. The corporate secretary confirmed the suspension. The sale stopped. The demolition permit was frozen. Then the board removed Richard from all remaining advisory authority and referred his conduct to the company's ethics committee. Charles did not object. He only said, "You have chosen ruins over the living." Richard closed the call. Lena had heard from the hallway. "Did you lose the company?" "Not yet." "Will you?" "Probably." She thought about that. "My mother says a choice is only expensive if you could have chosen the cheaper thing." Richard almost smiled. "Your mother says a great deal. She has to." People keep pretending not to hear her. The preservation order allowed state investigators to reopen the East Archives. The locker number hidden on the microfilm led them to a steel cabinet behind Straight Orson's old maintenance wing. Inside were 37 unopened envelopes addressed to Richard. All were written by Thomas Archer. The earliest letter was dated 7 months after the collapse. Richard read it in the presence of Mara and the patient advocate. "Richard," and he put Hull says, "you signed the new name because the company could not survive me. I do not know what I am allowed to remember, but I remember you promising that if one of us was trapped, the other would keep making noise." The next letters changed in tone. Some were angry, some were confused. Several contained sketches of Corridor C, notes about the altered safety report, and lists of families Thomas believed had been excluded from settlement records. One sentence appeared repeatedly, but never in exactly the same words. "I do not need you to rescue me. I need you to tell them the building was unsafe." The envelopes carried internal routing stamps from the Vale Family Continuity Trust. None had been mailed. Thomas had tried to act long before Sophia found him. Charles had not merely separated 2 brothers. He had intercepted a witness. The discovery weakened the guardianship petition. A judge ordered an independent capacity evaluation for Thomas and temporarily prohibited St. Orson from moving him. It did not restore his trust in Richard. During their next supervised meeting, Richard placed the letters on the table. "I never received them." Thomas did not touch them. "You received the warning before the building fell." Richard accepted the distinction. "Yes. You want the letters to make you innocent." "No. I want them to make Charles answerable." Thomas studied him. "And you?" "Me too." That answer held the room longer than an apology would have. The independent physician asked Thomas whether he understood the investigation. Thomas named the date, the facility, and the purpose of the meeting. He could describe his medications and refuse questions he did not wish to answer. His memory remained fractured around the collapse, but the preliminary assessment found no basis for treating every decision as meaningless. Thomas reached for one envelope, the one containing the family's names. "Then start with them." Before the meeting ended, Thomas consented to a limited kinship sample under the patient advocate's supervision. The court ordered the results sealed until the emergency hearing. The relief ledger contained more than a single transfer. Mara followed the accounts through shell partnerships and emergency financing vehicles. Money allocated for displaced Greyhaven residents had been used to buy voting shares from frightened investors during the collapse in Vale stock. The purchases gave the family trust permanent control of the company. Charles had used the disaster to save Vale Industries on his terms and to make sure no one could ever take control from him again. The financial evidence still needed validation. The trust's lawyers claimed the funds had been lawfully reassigned after settlements were paid. But several families on Thomas's list had never received settlement checks. One name matched Lena's grandmother. Sophia's family had lived in Greyhaven. Lena had not known. Her grandmother died when Sophia was young, leaving behind only a photograph and a warning never to work for Vale. Sophia had taken the demolition job because she needed the money. Then she found the names. The case was no longer a stranger, uncovering a rich family's secret. Sophia had walked into the place where her own family had been erased from the record. Mara located the original relief fund accountant, now living under assisted care. He agreed to give a statement if the interview occurred before Charles's lawyers could intervene. Before they could reach him, the investigator assigned to Greyhaven called. Someone had entered the preserved site through the rail yard door. No records had been removed. Instead, a row of names had been painted across the wall of room 29. 14 workers. 3 children. And beneath them, in fresh black letters, "Ask who profited from our deaths." Security footage showed the painter leaving through Corridor C. The man wore a hood, but his uneven gait matched Thomas Archer. Richard called St. Orson. Thomas was gone. Mara found Thomas before the police did. He was not hiding in Greyhaven. He was sitting in the basement of the old Union Hall across the river, surrounded by copies of names taken from settlement records. The hall had once served as a temporary relief office after the collapse. Thomas had broken no locks. A retired Union steward had let him in after recognizing the scars in an old rescue photograph. Richard arrived with Mara and the court-appointed patient advocate. Thomas did not apologize for leaving St. Orson. "They were going to move me again," he said. "The judge prohibited that. Paper did not stop them before." On the table lay a portable recorder, 3 unopened evidence bags, and a notebook filled with dates. Thomas had spent years reconstructing the collapse from fragments, medication labels, overheard staff conversations, returned letters, and account numbers copied from forms Charles expected him not to understand. He pushed the notebook toward Mara. "I could remember numbers before I could remember faces." The entries matched transfers in the relief ledger. One page contained the date of Richard's hospital stay and the serial number of his executive device. Another listed every night someone from the family trust accessed the T29 file. Another page explained the pager. Thomas had taken an obsolete Greyhaven transmitter from St. Orson's maintenance storage, replaced the lunchbox pager's battery, and linked the transmitter to an emergency repeater that still served the East Utility Corridor. The warning was his final safeguard. If Sophia could not stop the demolition, the device would send one last message while the charges were active. Municipal technicians later confirmed the signal path. The pager had not awakened by accident. Thomas had built the alarm himself. Thomas had not waited 20 years for rescue. He had been building a case without knowing whether anyone would ever read it. The emergency hearing began that afternoon. Because Greyhaven was under a preservation order, the state safety commissioner convened Vale Industries, the family trust, St. Orson, and representatives of the displaced families in the same chamber. The board attended remotely. Charles appeared with 4 attorneys. He looked at Thomas only once. The commissioner began with the structural report. Mara presented the microfilm original beside the filed revision. A document examiner explained the altered wording, matching staple holes, and missing revision sequence. The city permit archive confirmed Corridor C had been converted from an emergency route to a restricted utility passage. Charles's counsel argued that poor record-keeping from 20 years earlier could not prove intent. Then came the rescue evidence. Samuel Pierce appeared by secure video from an undisclosed location. Independent counsel had obtained his dispatch notes before the press attack. A second responder confirmed the Black Veil medical van. The vehicle number matched a trust maintenance log recovered from the Union Hall. Charles's attorneys challenged both men's memories. Mara did not rely on memory alone. She displayed the intake photograph, the laundry route, and the Wing C supply records. The court-appointed physician testified that Thomas understood the proceedings and had consistently expressed the same wish: restoration of his identity and disclosure of the Greyhaven records. The sealed kinship result, collected after Thomas's capacity review, was released at the hearing. The result showed a full sibling relationship between Thomas and Richard. Mara then addressed the biological records that had once pointed away from Thomas. The AB-positive blood type and dental chart were authentic, but they belonged to another injured worker transported on the same night. Original ambulance tags recovered from the Union archive showed that the two intake jackets had been switched before the St. Orson file was assembled. Charles's system had not invented false medical data. It had attached real data to the wrong man. No one in the chamber treated the result as the end of the case. It proved identity. It did not by itself explain who switched the intake jackets, blocked the letters, or manufactured the backdated placement agreement. Richard presented those next. He described the executive certificate used while he was unconscious, the Harbor Center address that did not yet exist, and the newer toner hidden on old stationery. Metadata tied the document's creation to a Vail Trust terminal. Charles's lead attorney stood. These records were generated during an emergency period involving an impaired survivor and a grieving executive. Administrative irregularity is not imprisonment. Thomas answered before Richard could. I asked to leave. The attorney turned toward him. Your medical notes describe confusion. I was confused about dates. I was not confused about doors. The commissioner asked Thomas what happened when he requested contact with Richard. They told me Richard signed against it. When I wrote, the letters came back to Charles's office. When I asked for a lawyer, they changed my medication. Staint. Orson's representative denied any unlawful treatment. Mara produced prescription changes made within 24 hours of 3-letter attempts. The records did not prove why the dosages changed, but they established the pattern. Charles finally spoke. Thomas was unstable, vulnerable, and surrounded by people who wanted to turn his injuries into litigation. I protected him when Richard could not protect himself. Richard looked at the families seated behind Mara. You also protected the company. I saved it. With relief money. The Financial Examiner traced the transfers through emergency partnerships into voting share purchases. Charles's attorneys argued that all funds had been legally reassigned after claims were resolved. The Examiner displayed 14 files marked settled. 8 contained no recipient signature. 3 checks had been deposited into accounts controlled by a Vail intermediary. 1 belonged to Sophia's mother. Sophia joined by video from an independent hospital. Her breathing remained shallow, but she spoke without sedation. She explained how Thomas approached her after recognizing her family name on an old cleanup roster. He asked her to place the lunchbox where demolition workers would find it if he failed to reach the East Corridor again. Charles's attorney asked whether she had accepted money from Richard. No. Medical support. Through a court order, not a private agreement. Did Mr. Vail promise you employment? No. What did he promise? Sophia looked toward Lena. That he would stop asking what I wanted long enough to ask what happened. Charles requested a recess. The commissioner refused. Richard then submitted the recording of his own argument with Thomas before the collapse. He did not shorten it. He let everyone hear him delay the evacuation. When it ended, Charles said, There. Your own evidence proves Richard made the decision. Richard stood. It proves I failed before the collapse. It does not excuse what happened after it. He waived the confidentiality protections attached to his old executive records and consented to investigation of his own conduct. The move removed Charles's strongest shield. He could no longer argue that disclosure would violate Richard's rights or damage the family privately. Charles looked at him with something close to disbelief. You would dismantle everything your father built. Richard answered, You already did. You just kept the name standing. The commissioner ordered the immediate seizure of the Trust's Greyhaven files, suspended Charles's guardianship authority, and referred the financial evidence for criminal review. Board members began disconnecting from the call. Thomas closed his notebook. Charles turned toward him. I kept you alive. Thomas met his eyes. You kept me useful. Security officers approached Charles's table, not to arrest him yet, but to prevent the removal of documents. The system around him was no longer taking his instructions. 3 weeks later, the Greyhaven Review reconvened in the city labor chamber. This time, no company logo appeared behind the speakers. The names of the dead and displaced were read first. 14 workers. 3 children, 29 families whose claims had been reduced, delayed, or closed without valid signatures. Charles sat at the defense table while investigators described the altered safety report, the false guardianship records, and the use of relief money to secure control of Vail Industries. His attorneys objected where they could, but the documents no longer depended on one witness or one memory. Sophia testified from a portable oxygen chair. The presiding commissioner stated that she was not a thief, an extortionist, or an unstable employee. She had preserved evidence after the company and its contractors failed to do so. The criminal complaint against her was dismissed. Her transfer to St. Orson was referred for separate investigation. Lena sat behind her mother. When the commissioner thanked her for bringing the lunchbox forward, she answered, "My mom brought it forward. I just carried it farther." Thomas's legal identity was restored. He declined the Vail surname and asked for time before deciding whether to use it again. The court granted him independent housing, medical counsel, and control over his records. Richard was called last. He repeated that he had delayed evacuation before the collapse. He did not blame grief, age, or Charles. "I taught myself that signing nothing made me less responsible," he said. "It only made it easier for someone else to act in my name." Vail Industries was placed under independent supervision. The Greyhaven sale remained suspended. The relief fund was reopened under third-party control. Charles faced investigation for document fraud, obstruction, unlawful financial diversion, and abuse of guardianship authority. No verdict came that day. But when the hearing ended, the families left with certified copies of records once hidden from them. After 20 years, the truth no longer belonged to the Vail family. Sophia left the hospital with a portable oxygen unit and instructions not to return to demolition work. Her recovery moved in small measurements, 10 steps without stopping, 1 full night without coughing, an hour at Lena's school meeting before fatigue forced her home. The damage to her lungs might improve, but no doctor promised it would disappear. Vail Industries offered a private settlement. Sophia refused the first version because it required confidentiality. She accepted only after the claim was transferred to the independent compensation process and recorded as workplace liability, not charity. Richard did not deliver the check. He attended the approval hearing, then sat in the back while Sophia's attorney explained what medical care would remain covered. Lena noticed. "You didn't try to make her thank you," she said afterward. "She shouldn't have to." "That's new." Yes, Richard did not return as CEO. The company appointed an interim board, sold 2 projects, and placed 3 construction divisions under outside safety review. Some employees blamed him for lost contracts. Others sent letters describing hazards they had been afraid to report. He read both kinds. Greyhaven remained standing behind a reinforced perimeter. Engineers entered room by room, while investigators cataloged walls, ledgers, and objects left by former residents. The city had not decided whether the building would be preserved, dismantled, or returned to the families. No one used the word memorial yet. Thomas moved into a supported apartment near the river. He chose Thomas Archer on the lease. When the clerk asked whether Vail should be added as a former legal name, he said, "Not today." Richard visited on Sundays with lunch from the same diner. He always knocked, even when the door was open. Some weeks Thomas let him in, some weeks he did not. On the 3rd visit, Richard brought restored family photographs. Thomas returned all but one. 2 boys sitting on a concrete barrier, sharing sandwiches from a metal box. "You were angry that day," Richard said. "You took the larger half." "I usually did." Thomas placed the photograph in a drawer. It was not forgiveness, but it was not refusal. Sophia and Lena moved to an apartment with cleaner air and a working elevator. The rent came from Sophia's compensation, not a Vail account. Lena insisted on that distinction whenever anyone called the move a gift. At school, classmates had seen her on television. Some treated her like a hero. Others repeated the accusation that her mother had planned everything for money. Lena struck one boy after he called Sophia a liar. Sophia made her apologize for hitting him, but not for defending her mother. "Being right does not make every choice right," she said. Richard heard about the meeting later and recognized the lesson. The reopened relief fund began contacting Greyhaven families. Several claims remained difficult because records were missing, people had died, and relatives disagreed over what justice should look like. The process did not repair 20 years in a season. Charles awaited trial under house confinement. He sent Richard one letter. It contained no apology. He wrote that history would judge whether Saving Vale Industries had justified what he had done. Richard placed the letter in the evidence archive without answering. Months later, Sophia was asked to speak at a labor review meeting. She brought the rusted lunchbox with her, not as an exhibit but as a container for her medication and Lena's lunch. Afterward, Thomas joined them at a small restaurant near the river. Richard arrived last and stopped beside the table, uncertain whether the empty chair was meant for him. Thomas moved his coat from it. They ate without discussing Grey Haven. Near the end of the meal, Lena opened the lunchbox and found 2 sandwiches wrapped in paper. She looked at Thomas. "I only packed one." "I know." Thomas pushed one sandwich toward Richard. "Do you remember what we put in there the first day?" Richard looked at the dented lid, the uneven initials, and the rust Sophia had refused to polish away. "2 sandwiches," he said. "One for each of us." Thomas nodded. Richard took the smaller half. No one called it a reunion. Sophia still needed oxygen. Lena still watched promises more closely than faces. Thomas still locked his door on difficult days. Richard still woke remembering the meeting he chose over the warning. Nothing made those years harmless. But when they left the restaurant, Lena carried the lunchbox between them, and no one asked her to carry it alone.